Hello, we're looking at forearm routines from the vintage muscle magazines from the 1930s to 1978, filtered through biomechanics textbooks and leading to joint-friendly fitness. At the top left, an ad from Muscle Training Illustrated 1966. If you order it now, you have as much chance of getting it as if you ordered it then, or at least that's what we thought. Clockwise from there, we have Frank Zane from his pamphlet course, Developing a Classic Muscular Upper Body. Below that, we have Mike Mentzer's Forearm from 1979's IFBB album of Bodybuilding All-Stars hardcover. And we have Dave Draper from every edition of Here's Power for You by David Manners, one of the earliest how-to books on weight training that I owned. From the 1930s, How to Become a Muscular He-Man by George Jowett. No, I did not buy this new. This was the kind of course that was sold through comic books and men's magazines of the time, and there's a long story behind its publishing history. I put a link in the description. This was the time of old-time strongmen, so much of the grip building advice has to do with lifting kegs and such. This is only one sample of the exercises shown in the pamphlet. Under your wonderful forearm muscle, the top right. Quote, in the Jowett Institute course of bodybuilding, there's an endless chain of exercise, of course. You could do nothing better than to enroll in it at once. Very subtle. Some things don't change. Also notice on the lower right, at the lower third of the page, the exercise he calls finger pulling. Now trust me on this, as an older guy, if anyone anywhere says, pull my finger, don't do it. A mere 30 or so years later, he's still at it in the new, at the time, muscle magazines, only this time showing a lot more butt. The diagrams here showing the wrist and reverse wrist curl and twists imply that his training advice had changed, but nope. When you read the article, it's the same keg lifting and strongman stunts as in the original. Now this appeared in the second issue of Muscle Training Illustrated. Muscle Training Illustrated, published by Dan Lurie out of Brooklyn, a competitor to the Weider magazines. So on the left is the MTI from January 1966. On the right, one of the Weider publications from May 1967. That's Frank Zane on the cover. Such a relatively calm cover, like most of the text fell off. And inside, Dave Draper, Complete Development of the Forearms. An interesting coincidence, a few years after this, 1972 or 3 or so, I went to a Dan Lurie contest in Manhattan, and the big draws were Sergio Oliva, Boyer Coe, Dave Draper, and Frank Zane, all of whom came out of cabs and walked through the crowd of us. One of the most impressive sights was Zane wearing a regular button-down shirt, sleeves down to his elbows, but his forearms were huge. Now back to the article. Notice the artwork on the left long before digital images. In the article itself, Zottman curls, 5 sets of 10. Reverse curls, 5 sets of 10. Reverse wrist curl, 4 sets of 12. Wrist curls, 4 sets of 15. And then under the tips, 3 to 5 days a week. And on your off days, crumple newspaper or use a wrist roller. Couple of comments. The Zottman curls, an old-time exercise. It's a palms up dumbbell curl, rotate at the top, and then a negative reverse curl. So it's a combination of movements, grip rotating, and a negative reverse curl that involve the forearm. So it's not particularly efficient or precise in targeting muscles in the forearm, but under control, I don't really see much risk in it. The reverse wrist curl with the dumbbell, if you're going to do them, this is probably less stressful joint-wise than with a bar. Since I mentioned Zane and his forearms, this is from an undated pamphlet of his from the early 70s, which is when I got it, with actually a fairly reasonable set rep scheme on the left, 3 or 4 sets per exercise, starting with 12 reps, adding weight, and lowering the reps each set with 2 minutes rest between sets. And for forearms, He's recommending two exercises, the reverse easy curl and wrist curls. And as we've seen in the earlier two videos, taking his low set approach to a new low, Mike Mentzer, not training the forearms, sometimes it's better. I can imagine the phone call after turning this article in. Mike, here at the Weider Research Clinic, not training is kind of the opposite of what we publish. Now, according to the article, Mentzer rarely trained forearms because A, he felt, quote, his calves and forearms grew better with little or no direct work, and B, that the indirect work of holding bars and handles as part of his other exercises were enough. When he does train forearms, like Zane, he likes the regular wrist curl and reverse curl with heavy weights, 10 reps to failure, once or twice a week after upper arms. Now, there are some inconsistencies in the article. For instance, two of the pictures of the reverse wrist curl, which he omits in the text, and the, quote, medial radialis muscle is mentioned a few times, which sounds good, but it's not quite right. But I do think his general point that gripping is enough is closer to right and certainly joint friendlier, not that that was one of his concerns, than doing too many exercises for the hands and forearms. To summarize the exercise selections, Jowett and Mentzer emphasize gripping with some side exercises to cover most of the forearm and hand muscles. Zane and Mentzer like the reverse curl and the wrist curl. Draper added the reverse wrist curl for wrist extensors and the zottman curl for the pronation and supination muscles. And now 2024 being what it is, since I've been working on this, my socials have been flooded with devices that load finger extension and individual finger flexion. So let's see if there's anything about the wrist and hand in biomechanics. Here's one of the references I used, Basic Biomechanics of the Musculoskeletal System, which I first saw in Tom Purvis's references, and I had an earlier copy. This one, an intern left behind, thank you, Emily. In the center is the table of contents, and notice that the wrist and hand chapter is comparable, if not longer, than each of the other joint chapters. The textbooks in general describe the hand as an organ because in addition to physical movements, it acts as an extension of the brain for expression and sensing touch. And the wrist is important because the position and health of the wrist affects how the hand works. On the right is an outline of the wrist and hand chapter, which, if you're doing hand rehabilitation, would be a start. Here's a list of all the muscles in the wrist and hand. Bottom left, you see the flexor group, the extensor group, and the pronator supinator group, which includes the brachioradialis, or in gym terms, wrist curls, reverse wrist curls, and hammer curls. On the right, all the muscles of the hand, and I'll explain why you wouldn't try to design an exercise for each one specifically. So not for hand rehabilitation, but for weight training for wellness, wellness plus, bodybuilding, you can boil all the biomechanics down to these 3 points. The difference between power grip and precision handling, how the wrist and hand position affect each other, and why to keep the weight from pushing your hand back. In other words, why to be leery of the bottom of a wrist curl. The power grip on the left, precision handling on the right. The power grip, which you use without thinking about when you're lifting, all 4 fingers act as a unit, the finger flexors act as a group, and the thumb helps position the object, but it isn't loaded. Precision handling, the thumb works opposite all or some or one finger. This is the significance of the, quote, opposable thumb, the precision work, not the strength of the thumb. Pages 150 to 151 from Atlas of the Human Body. These are the muscles of the hand, direct quote. As the actions depend on precision, not power, there is no need for a large bulk of contractile tissue, and these muscles can be contained within the hand. So if you load the thumb, say with a reverse curl or a device that hooks the thumb, or the individual fingers like the old-fashioned eagle claw or some of the newer devices, if these muscles do hypertrophy, they'd get in the way, or if you strain them, the strain would interfere with any precision work you need your hand for. Here are the wrist flexors and finger flexors from the forearm, so not within the hand. So Jowett and Mentzer, with their emphasis on the grip, were working the groups of muscles that are the bulk of the forearm compared to the finger and wrist extensors are less bulky than the flexors because their function is not to move a load. Finger extensors open your grip to release a load, so they only have to be strong enough to lift the weight of the fingers themselves. The current influencer bit about working the finger extensors, okay, but they have no bearing on a strong grip or significantly adding muscle to the forearm. The wrist extensors, on the other hand, do affect the grip. From Brunstrom's Clinical Kinesiology. On the left, it explains that for maximum range of motion around the wrist, you close your fist in extension and open it in flexion. So if you want to do the wrist curl with a large range of motion, and that's a very big if, your hand should be closed at the bottom and allowed to open at the top. With the reverse wrist curl, you would allow it to open at the bottom and close it at the top, again, if you wanted to train through a large range of motion. The page on the right relates to gripping. So at the right top, in wrist flexion, you can't hold a tight fist due to active insufficiency of the finger flexors. On the right bottom, your grip is stronger in slight extension and opening the grip is easier in slight flexion. This is why every martial arts disarm pushes the weapon hand into flexion. And also the reasoning behind the gripping exercise I give in Joint Friendly Fitness. These are the main muscles mentioned as the pronator-supinator group. On the left, the brachioradialis. On the right, specific pronator and supinator muscles. You might remember from the vintage arms video that with the elbow bent, the biceps takes over supination, which means trying to train supination with the elbow straight if you're doing it for the forearms. That gets more complicated because it's almost unavoidable that shoulder internal and external rotation gets involved. If you're training to have muscular forearms, the hammer curl is more efficient. It loads the brachioradialis directly, which is inherently larger than either the pronator or the supinator and helps with both functions. The last point has to do with letting the weight bend your hand back to the limit of wrist extension. So the bottom of a wrist curl, and one old muscle magazine biceps tip, which was to, quote, bend the wrist away from the body when doing curls. This is a picture of the carpal tunnel, which, when using a keyboard became a standard part of work life, became famous for carpal tunnel syndrome. All the tendons, nerves, blood vessels to the hand go through an arch created by carpal bones and fibrous tissue, so not an actual tunnel, but it functions like a tunnel, the same way a spinal column isn't a column but functions like one. Now with carpal tunnel syndrome, holding a specific posture created an inflammation, which led to swelling, which affected the hand and the fingers. The issue isn't just the posture, it's the inflammation of the wrist that affects the hand. So if you think your hands and wrists are bothering you, and you let weights bend your wrists to their anatomic stop, you're probably right. So all of the preceding is why in joint-friendly fitness, I preferred the hammer curl and the gripping roll-up exercise over the reverse and regular wrist curl. The wrist curls are the conventional forearm exercises, and I do give tips on how to do them safer so that you can decide for yourself which exercises are right for you. The print version of Joint Friendly Fitness, which covers the biomechanics for all the joints and muscle groups and over 70 exercises. And on the right, the shoulder and arm Kindle, if you just want the shoulder, upper arm, and forearm sections. There are also 10 new routines, not in the print book, that are specific to shoulders and arms, admittedly influenced by the Mentzer and the Health for Life routines. Links are in the description. Happy training, and remember, don't pull any fingers.